The stagecoach kicked up dust like a funeral procession. Caleb Mercer stood outside the general store in Benson's Ridge, Wyoming, his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, watching the road with the same enthusiasm a man might watch his own hanging. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, shoulders tight beneath a worn coat that had seen better years. Around him, the town moved with its usual indifference. Men loading freight, women clutching market baskets, children weaving between wagon wheels like they owned the world. Nobody paid him much attention. That's how Caleb preferred it. He'd been standing there 20 minutes, maybe longer. Time moved differently when you were waiting for something you weren't sure you wanted. The telegram in his pocket had arrived 3 weeks ago, short and to the point. Arriving June 14th. V. Hale. No pleasantries. No promises. Just confirmation that the arrangement he'd made in a moment of whiskey-soaked desperation was actually going to happen. A mail-order bride. The words still tasted sour in his mouth. Caleb wasn't a romantic. He'd buried that part of himself years ago, somewhere between the war and the grave he'd dug for his brother on the ranch's North Ridge. What he needed now wasn't love. It was survival. The ranch was failing. Not dramatically, not in some catastrophic blaze of bad luck, but in the slow, grinding way that happened when a man worked alone and the land demanded more than one person could give. He needed help. He needed another set of hands. He needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about the silences that stretched through his days like open wounds. So he'd done what desperate men do. He'd written a letter to a matrimonial agency back east, listing his requirements with the same practicality he'd used to order fence posts. Must be healthy. Accustomed to hard work, no expectations of luxury. He hadn't mentioned loneliness, though it sat heavier on him than any physical labor ever had. Loneliness was something you didn't advertise, even when it was killing you. The stagecoach rounded the bend. Caleb's stomach clenched. He straightened slightly, pulling his hands from his pockets, trying to look like a man who had his life together. He didn't. The ranch was barely holding on, his debts were mounting, and he hadn't had a full night's sleep in longer than he could remember. But he could stand up straight and meet a woman's eyes without flinching. That had to count for something. The coach slowed, wheels grinding against the packed dirt road. The driver, a grizzled man named Tucker, who'd been running this route for 15 years, gave Caleb a brief nod before climbing down to unlatch the door. "Got your delivery, Mercer," Tucker called, his tone carrying the kind of amusement Caleb didn't appreciate. Caleb didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the coach door. It opened. And Vivian Hale stepped out. The first thing Caleb noticed was that she wasn't small. The women he'd known, his mother, his sister-in-law, the few ranch wives in the territory, had all carried themselves with a certain compactness, like they were apologizing for taking up space. Vivian didn't apologize for anything. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with curves that filled out her dark green traveling dress in ways that made it clear she'd never fit the mold society tried to press women into. The second thing he noticed was her face. She wasn't pretty in the delicate way men's magazines advertised. Her features were strong, defined cheekbones, a straight nose, a mouth set in a line that suggested she'd learned not to smile unless she meant it. But her eyes caught him. They were sharp, intelligent, the kind of eyes that saw through pretense and didn't suffer fools. She looked at him the way you'd assess a horse before buying it. Caleb realized he was staring. "Miss Hale," his voice came out rougher than intended. "Mrs. Mercer, I assume." She didn't smile. "Though we can skip the formalities, Vivian is fine." She reached back into the coach and pulled out a worn carpet bag, declining Tucker's half-hearted offer of help. When she turned back to Caleb, there was something in her expression, not quite defiance, but close, like she was daring him to say what she'd heard 1,000 times before. Caleb cleared his throat. "I've got the wagon around back." "Good." No pleasantries, no nervous laughter, just a woman who'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger and wasn't interested in pretending it was anything other than what it was. They walked in silence. The wagon was parked behind Miller's Feed and Supply, a battered flatbed Caleb used for hauling equipment. It wasn't fancy, but it was functional. He loaded Vivian's bag into the back with more care than he usually showed cargo, then offered his hand to help her up. She took it. Her grip was firm, strong, not the kind of hand that had spent its life in parlors. Once she was seated, Caleb climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses, Two aging geldings named Duke and Ranger started forward without needing much encouragement. They knew the way home. The silence stretched. Caleb wasn't good at conversation under the best circumstances. And these were decidedly not the best circumstances. He snuck a glance at Vivian from the corner of his eye. She sat straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape roll past with the same careful assessment she'd given him. "It's about an hour to the ranch," he finally said. "All right." More silence. Caleb gripped the reins tighter. "It's not much. The house is small. 2 rooms, really. I've been fixing it up, but I didn't come here expecting a mansion, Mr. Mercer." "Caleb?" She turned to look at him. "Caleb, then." Something in her tone made him feel like he was being tested, though he wasn't sure for what. He focused on the road, where the dirt track cut through rolling grassland dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stand of cottonwoods. The land here was beautiful in a harsh way, all sky and wind and endless horizon. It broke people who weren't prepared for it. He wondered if Vivian was prepared. "You come from the East?" he asked, immediately regretting how stupid the question sounded. Of course she came from the East. The agency was in Philadelphia. "Boston," she said. "Or near enough. Must be different out here." "Very." He waited for her to elaborate. She didn't. The wagon creaked over a rutted section of road. Caleb felt every bump in his bones, the kind of bone-deep ache that came from too many years of hard work and not enough rest. He was 34, but some days he felt twice that. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian's voice cut through his thoughts. "Sure." "Why did you send for a wife?" Caleb's jaw tightened. It was a fair question, but that didn't make it easier to answer. "Ranch needs 2 people to run it properly. I've been managing alone since my brother passed 3 years back. It's not working." "So you need a worker." "I need a partner." The distinction felt important, though Caleb wasn't entirely sure why. Vivian nodded slowly. "And what do you expect from this partnership?" "Hard work. Honesty. Someone who won't run off when things get difficult." "That's all?" Caleb glanced at her. "What else would there be?" Something flickered in her expression, too quick to name, but it looked like disappointment, or maybe relief. She turned back to the landscape. "Nothing, I suppose." They rode in silence for another 20 minutes before the ranch came into view. It wasn't much to look at. A small wooden house with a covered porch, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a few outbuildings scattered across the property like afterthoughts. Fencing stretched in uneven lines across the grazing land, and in the distance, Caleb's small herd of horses grazed near the creek. He felt embarrassed suddenly, seeing it through her eyes. The paint was peeling. The porch steps needed replacing. The whole place had the worn-down look of something barely holding together. "This is it," he said quietly. Vivian studied the property with that same careful assessment. "How many horses?" 15, mostly mares. I've been trying to build a breeding program, but it's slow going without—" He stopped himself. "Without help," Vivian finished. "Yeah." She climbed down from the wagon before he could offer assistance, landing with a solid thump that sent dust puffing around her boots. She walked toward the barn with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she knew exactly where she was going, even though she'd never been here before. Caleb followed, carrying her carpet bag. The barn door hung open, letting in afternoon light that cut through the dust and hay smell. Inside, the horses shifted in their stalls, ears pricked forward with curiosity. Vivian walked straight to the nearest stall, where a dappled gray mare named Stella stood watching her with dark, liquid eyes. "Hey there," Vivian murmured, extending her hand slowly. Stella sniffed her fingers, then allowed Vivian to stroke her neck. Caleb stopped in his tracks. Stella was skittish around strangers, always had been. It usually took weeks before she'd let someone new touch her. "You know horses," he said. It wasn't a question. "My father bred them," Vivian replied, still focused on the mare. "Before he died. I grew up in the stables." The agency didn't mention that. "I didn't tell them." She moved to the next stall where a younger mare watched her with interest. "They were more concerned with whether I could cook and keep house. I didn't think my experience with livestock would matter." "It matters." She glanced back at him, and for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, something in her expression softened. Not much, just enough that Caleb caught a glimpse of the person beneath the armor. "Good," she said simply. They toured the rest of the property as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Caleb showed her the house, the chicken coop, the vegetable garden he'd let go half to seed, the creek that ran along the property's eastern boundary. Vivian absorbed it all without comment, her sharp eyes cataloging every detail. By the time they returned to the house, dusk was settling across the land like a blanket. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than it had any right to. One main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A doorway led to the single bedroom, Caleb's room, though he'd spent the past week trying to make it presentable for Vivian. His bedroll was now set up in the barn. They might be married on paper, but he wasn't going to force anything she wasn't ready for. Vivian set her carpet bag down and looked around. The space was clean, at least. Caleb had scrubbed it within an inch of its life, trying to erase 3 years of bachelor existence. "There's venison stew on the stove," he said awkwardly. "Not fancy, but it's hot." "Thank you." They ate in silence at the small wooden table. Caleb had never been good at small talk, and Vivian didn't seem inclined to fill the quiet. The stew was decent, he'd made sure of that, but neither of them had much appetite. Finally, Vivian set down her spoon. "We should discuss the sleeping arrangements," she said, her tone practical. Caleb's ears burned. "I'll be in the barn. The bedroom's yours." "That's not necessary." "It is." She studied him across the table, and Caleb had the uncomfortable feeling of being X-rayed. "Let me be clear, Caleb. I came here understanding what this arrangement was. I'm not expecting romance or anything else, but I'm also not expecting you to sleep in the barn like hired help. There's a bed large enough for 2 people who can be adults about sharing space." The directness of it threw him completely off balance. "I just thought, you thought I'd be uncomfortable," Vivian said. "I appreciate that, but practical matters trump comfort out here, don't they? We're both exhausted. The bed is larger than the barn floor. We can manage." Caleb wanted to argue, but she had a point. The barn floor was hell on his back, and he had a full day's work ahead of him tomorrow. They were both adults. They could handle this. "All right," he said finally, "but if you change your mind, I won't." They finished eating in a silence that felt slightly less oppressive than before. After cleaning up, Vivian insisted on helping despite his protests. They prepared for bed with the awkward choreography of strangers trying not to intrude on each other's space. Caleb let her use this bedroom first while he checked the animals one last time. When he returned, she was already in bed, turned toward the wall, the blankets pulled up to her shoulders. He changed quickly, blew out the lamp, and slid under the covers on his side of the bed, leaving a careful gap between them. The darkness felt alive with tension. "Caleb?" Vivian's voice came soft through the dark. "Yeah?" "Thank you for not lying to me." He wasn't sure what she meant by that, but something in her tone suggested it mattered. "You're welcome." They lay there, 2 strangers in a shared bed, listening to the wind rattle the windows and the distant sound of horses settling for the night. Caleb didn't sleep much. He was too aware of her presence, the warmth radiating from her side of the bed, the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the weight of everything unsaid between them. But sometime deep in the night, exhaustion won. And when dawn broke through the curtains, harsh and unforgiving, a new life had officially begun. The first week passed in a blur of work and careful distance. Vivian proved herself immediately. She woke before dawn without complaint, dressed in practical clothes she'd clearly brought for the purpose, and dove into the ranch work with a competence that left Caleb speechless. She knew her way around horses, really knew, not just the polite acquaintance wealthy women sometimes claimed. She could gentle a nervous mare, check hooves for stones, assess the quality of hay with a glance. But it was more than skill. It was the way she moved through the work, like she'd been waiting her whole life to do something real. Caleb found himself watching her more than he should. The way she handled the feed buckets, muscles flexing beneath her sleeves. The way she talked to the horses, her voice dropping into a soothing register that made even Stella relax. The way she didn't flinch from the hard, dirty work that came with ranch life. She wasn't what he'd expected. She was better, and that terrified him. On the 4th day, Caleb was mending fence on the south pasture when he heard shouting from the barn. He dropped his tools and ran, his heart hammering with the kind of panic that came from too many years of things going wrong. He found Vivian in the barn, standing in front of the stall where his prize mare, Dahlia, was laboring. The mare was on her side, heaving, her eyes rolling with pain and fear. What happened? Caleb demanded. The foal's breech, Vivian said, her voice tight but controlled. She's been trying for over an hour. It's not turning. Caleb's stomach dropped. Breech births killed mares and foals more often than not. He'd lost 2 horses this way already, watching helplessly as they struggled and died despite everything he tried. We need to call Doc Henderson, he said, already moving toward the door.
There's no time. Vivian was rolling up her sleeves. By the time you ride to town and bring him back, they'll both be dead. You can't. I've done this before. She looked at him, and there was steel in her eyes. 3 times. Once with my father, twice on my own after he died. I know what I'm doing, Caleb, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?
Every instinct screamed at him to ride for the doctor, to not let this stranger risk his most valuable mare. But something in Vivian's expression, the absolute certainty, the lack of hesitation, made him pause. What do you need? He asked. Relief flickered across her face. Hot water, clean cloths, and I need you to hold her head, keep her calm. Caleb moved. The next hour was brutal. Vivian worked with her hands inside the struggling mare, her face set in concentration, while sweat poured down her temples. Caleb held Dahlia's head in his lap, murmuring nonsense, feeling the mare's pain in every trembling muscle. Come on, sweetheart, Vivian muttered, repositioning her hands. Work with me here. Dahlia screamed, a sound no horse should make. I've almost got it, Vivian said, her voice strained. Just a little more. Something shifted. Vivian's expression changed, tension giving way to fierce focus. She adjusted her grip, pulled, and suddenly the foal was sliding free in a rush of fluid and membrane. It landed in the straw, motionless. Vivian was on it immediately, clearing its airway, rubbing its sides with rough strokes designed to stimulate breathing. Caleb watched, frozen, as seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a gasp. The foal's chest heaved. It coughed, shook its head, and took its first real breath. Vivian sat back on her heels, her entire body shaking, her dress ruined, her face streaked with sweat, and God knew what else. She'd done it. Caleb stared at her, this woman who'd walked into his life a week ago and just saved 2 lives with her bare hands. You... His voice cracked. He tried again. You saved them. Vivian looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her armor cracked completely. Her eyes shone with tears she didn't let fall, her mouth trembling with exhaustion and relief. Yeah, she said softly. I did. Something fundamental shifted in that barn, between the smell of blood and hay and new life. Caleb felt it like a physical thing, the walls he'd built around himself starting to crack. He'd been prepared for a worker. He'd been prepared for a stranger sharing his space. He hadn't been prepared for Vivian Hale. And as he watched her gently encourage the foal to its feet, coaching it toward its mother with infinite patience, Caleb realized something that scared him more than any breech birth ever could. He was starting to care about her. That was a problem. Because Caleb Mercer had learned the hard way that caring about people only meant more pain when you inevitably lost them. And he'd already lost too much. See, the nights were the hardest. They shared the bed with careful distance, both pretending sleep came easier than it did. Sometimes Caleb lay awake listening to Vivian breathe, wondering what brought a woman like her to the middle of nowhere to marry a man she'd never met. He wanted to ask. He never did. But on the 10th night, Vivian broke the silence. Can I ask you something? Caleb had thought she was asleep. Sure. Your brother. Her voice was quiet in the darkness. What happened to him? The question landed like a punch. Caleb stared at the ceiling, his jaw tight. Accident. Stupid, preventable accident. We were bringing down a dead tree near the North Ridge. I told him to wait, to let me check the stability. He didn't listen. It fell wrong. I'm sorry. He was always like that. Impulsive. Thought he was invincible. Caleb's throat felt tight. He wasn't. Silence stretched between them. Then Vivian said, My mother died when I was 12. Consumption. My father never really recovered. He kept working, kept breeding horses, but it was like part of him died with her. He passed 5 years ago. Heart failure, the doctor said. I think it was grief. Caleb turned his head toward her, though he could only see her outline in the dark. And after that, I lived with my aunt in Boston. She meant well, I think, but she spent most of her energy trying to marry me off to men who saw me as either a charitable project or a joke. I got tired of being looked at like I was something that needed fixing. You don't need fixing. The words came out before Caleb could stop them. Vivian went still. What? You heard me. Another long silence. Then, so quietly, he almost missed it. Thank you. They didn't talk after that, but something had shifted. The space between them in the bed felt less like a barrier and more like a choice, one they were both making deliberately. Caleb fell asleep, thinking about the way Vivian had looked covered in blood and straw, her face fierce with determination. He fell asleep thinking maybe, just maybe, he'd gotten lucky after all. What? The next morning brought trouble. Caleb was checking the fence line when he spotted 3 riders approaching from the east. He recognized them immediately, Tom Bradley and his sons, neighbors from the adjoining property. The Bradleys had never been friendly, but they'd mostly kept to themselves. Until now. Caleb walked out to meet them, his hand resting casually near the rifle he kept strapped to his saddle. Morning, Tom. Tom Bradley was a hard man, weathered by years of frontier living and made mean by it. He looked Caleb up and down with barely concealed contempt. Heard you brought yourself a woman from back east. News travels fast. It does. Tom spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Also heard she's a big girl. That true? Caleb's jaw clenched. I'd mind your tongue, Tom. Just making conversation. But there was a meanness in Tom's eyes that said otherwise. My boys were wondering if she's as sturdy as they say. Might could use a woman like that for heavy work, if you're looking to rent her out. The insult was deliberate, calculated to provoke. Caleb's hand tightened on the rifle. You need to leave. Now. Tom's sons, both in their 20s, both carrying their father's meanness, shifted in their saddles. The older one, Pete, grinned. Touchy, ain't he? Must be the woman's got him all. Caleb had the rifle up and pointed before Pete could finish the sentence. Get off my land, he said, his voice deadly quiet. And don't come back. For a moment, tension crackled in the air. Tom's hand drifted toward his own weapon, and Caleb knew with absolute certainty that if this went bad, someone was going to die. Then a voice cut through the standoff. Problem here, gentlemen. Vivian walked out from the barn, carrying a bucket of feed like she hadn't just interrupted what could have been a gunfight. She looked completely unconcerned, but Caleb noticed the way she positioned herself, at an angle that gave her a clear view of all 3 men while keeping Caleb in her peripheral vision. Tom looked her up and down with the kind of slow, insulting assessment that made Caleb's trigger finger itch. Just getting acquainted with the new Mrs. Mercer, Tom said. Vivian set down the bucket. Well, now you've met me. Was there anything else? Her tone was pleasant, but there was something underneath it, a steel core that said she wouldn't tolerate disrespect, not from these men, not from anyone. Tom seemed to realize he'd miscalculated. This wasn't some timid Eastern woman he could intimidate. This was someone who'd look him in the eye and not blink. We'll be going, he said finally. Just wanted to welcome you to the territory. How kind. Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. Don't let us keep you. The Bradleys rode off, but not before Pete threw one last look over his shoulder, the kind of look that promised this wasn't over. When they were out of sight, Caleb lowered the rifle. You shouldn't have come out here, he said. Why? Because they might have seen me? Vivian picked up her bucket. I'm not hiding, Caleb. Not from them, not from anyone. They're dangerous. So am I when I need to be. She walked back to the barn, leaving Caleb standing there trying to figure out whether he should be angry or impressed. He settled on impressed. But the encounter left a sour taste. The Bradleys were trouble, and Caleb had just made it clear that Vivian was under his protection. In this territory, that kind of declaration came with consequences. He'd deal with them when they came. For now, there was work to do. The foal Vivian had named her Hope over Caleb's protest that you didn't name working animals was thriving. The little filly followed Vivian around like a shadow, and watching them together did something strange to Caleb's chest. He'd been alone so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone to share things with. He'd forgotten what it felt like to want to protect something beyond just his land and livestock. And as summer deepened across the Wyoming frontier, as the days grew longer and the work harder, Caleb Mercer found himself fighting a losing battle against his own carefully constructed walls. Because somewhere between the shared meals and the quiet conversations in the dark, and the way Vivian laughed when Hope tried to nurse from the wrong end of Dahlia, Caleb had started to feel something he'd sworn he never would again. Hope. And that, he knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. Summer hit Wyoming like a hammer, all scorching days and restless nights, where the heat seemed to press down from above and rise up from below at the same time. The work didn't stop for weather. If anything, it intensified. Fences needed constant mending, the vegetable garden Vivian had resurrected demanded daily attention, and the horses required care that didn't respect human comfort. Caleb found himself working alongside Vivian in a rhythm that felt almost natural, though he kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. People didn't just slot into your life this easily. There had to be cracks somewhere, problems lurking beneath the surface. But weeks passed, and the cracks never appeared. Instead, something else developed. Something that made Caleb more nervous than any structural flaw would have. They were becoming friends. It started small. Vivian had opinions about everything: how to rotate the pastures, which mares to breed next season, whether the barn door hung straight or not. At first, Caleb bristled at the suggestions. He'd been running this place alone for 3 years. He knew what he was doing, except Vivian's ideas were usually better than his. "You're putting too much hay in the far stalls," she said one morning, about 2 weeks after the incident with the Bradleys. She stood in the barn doorway, arms crossed, watching him distribute feed. Caleb paused mid-scoop. "The horses in those stalls are bigger, they eat more. They're also less active because you keep them stalled longer. They're getting fat." He looked at the horses in question, 2 older geldings he used for heavy hauling. Now that Vivian mentioned it, they did look rounder than they should. "Huh," he said. Vivian's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "I'll take that as agreement." "Don't get smug." "Wouldn't dream of it." But she was smug, and somehow that didn't bother him as much as it should have. The garden thrived under Vivian's attention in ways it never had under his. She coaxed vegetables from the stubborn Wyoming soil through what appeared to be sheer force of will, talking to the plants the same way she talked to the horses. Firm but encouraging, like she expected them to do better, and knew they could. Caleb caught himself watching her more than once, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her hair escaping its pins, completely absorbed in the work. There was something about the way she moved, economical, purposeful, like every motion mattered. She never complained, not about the heat, the work, the isolation, or the Spartan conditions of the cabin. She just did what needed doing and expected Caleb to do the same. It was exactly what he'd asked for. So why did it make him feel guilty? One evening, after a particularly brutal day of hauling water from the creek to keep the garden alive, they sat on the porch watching the sun sink toward the mountains. Vivian had made biscuits, actual good biscuits, not the hockey pucks Caleb usually produced, and they ate them with honey while the heat slowly bled out of the air. "This land hates people," Vivian said suddenly. Caleb looked at her. "What?" "The land. It's actively hostile to human habitation." She gestured at the endless expanse of grass and sky. "It's beautiful, but it doesn't want us here." "That's one way to look at it." "How do you look at it?" Caleb considered the question. "I think it's indifferent. It doesn't hate us or love us. It just is, and we either figure out how to exist with it, or we don't." Vivian nodded slowly. "That's bleaker than my version." "You asked." She smiled then, a real smile, not the polite mask she usually wore. It changed her whole face, made her look younger, less guarded. Caleb felt something shift in his chest and immediately looked away. Dangerous. This was dangerous. "I should check on Dahlia," he said abruptly, standing. Vivian's smile faded. "All right." He escaped to the barn, where Dahlia and Hope were settled for the night. The foal was growing fast, all gangly legs and curiosity. She stuck her nose over the stall door, snuffling at Caleb's shirt. "You're trouble," he told her. Hope snorted, unimpressed. Behind him, footsteps approached. Caleb knew without looking that it was Vivian. He'd learned the sound of her walk, the particular rhythm of it. "Did I say something wrong?" she asked quietly. "No." "You ran off pretty quick." Caleb kept his eyes on Hope. "Wasn't running. Looked like running from where I was sitting." He turned to face her. In the dim light of the barn, with hay dust floating in the air and the horses shifting in their stalls, Vivian looked like she belonged here, like she'd always been part of this place. That thought scared him more than he wanted to admit. "I'm not good at this," he said finally. "At what?" "Talking. Being around people. Any of it." The words came out rougher than intended. "I've been alone a long time, Vivian. I don't know how to—" He gestured helplessly between them. Understanding crossed her face. "You think I'm going to expect something from you, something you can't give. Aren't you?" She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful. "I told you the first night what I expected. Hard work, honesty, partnership. That hasn't changed." "And that's enough for you? Just work? Is it enough for you?" The question caught him off guard. Was it enough? A month ago, he would have said yes without hesitation. Now, standing in this barn with this woman who'd saved his horses and fixed his garden and slept beside him every night without asking for anything he couldn't give. Now he wasn't sure. "I don't know," he admitted. Vivian stepped closer, not touching, but near enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Then maybe we figure it out together, one day at a time. No expectations beyond what we agreed to. And if things change, then we'll deal with it when it happens." Her expression softened. "I'm not going to break Caleb, and I'm not going anywhere." He wanted to believe that. He wanted it so badly it physically hurt. "Okay," he said quietly. She nodded, then reached out and squeezed his hand once before heading back to the house. Caleb stood there long after she'd gone, staring at his hand like it held answers he couldn't quite read. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Caleb was replacing a rotted board on the chicken coop when he heard the wagon. He looked up to see Mrs. Patterson, the general store owner's wife, driving toward the house with two other women from town. His stomach sank. Social calls in this territory usually meant trouble of one kind or another. Vivian emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been baking bread, and flour dusted her arms up to the elbows. "Mrs. Mercer!" Mrs. Patterson called, pulling the wagon to a stop. "I hope we're not intruding." "Not at all," Vivian said, her tone perfectly polite despite the obvious lie. "What brings you out this way?" The three women climbed down, carrying baskets covered with checkered cloth. Mrs. Patterson was a small, sharp-eyed woman who ran the social hierarchy of Benson's Ridge with an iron fist disguised as Christian charity. The other two, Mrs. Chen and Mrs. O'Malley, were newer to town, their husbands having claimed land in the past year. "We wanted to welcome you properly," Mrs. Patterson said, "bring you some preserves and introduce ourselves. It's important for the ladies of the territory to stick together." Caleb caught the edge in her voice. This wasn't a welcome wagon. This was an inspection. Vivian seemed to sense it too, but her expression didn't change. "That's very kind. Would you like to come inside? I've just made coffee." "We'd love to." Caleb watched them file into the cabin, feeling distinctly useless. He went back to fixing the chicken coop, but kept one ear turned toward the house. Inside, he could hear the murmur of female voices, rising and falling, punctuated by occasional laughter. He couldn't make out words, but the tone was familiar. Probing. Testing. Seeing if Vivian measured up. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Caleb finished the chicken coop and started mending harness leather, working within earshot of the open window. "Quite surprising when we heard Caleb had sent for a bride," Mrs. Patterson was saying. "He's been so withdrawn since his brother passed." "It's been hard for him," Vivian replied. Her voice was calm, giving nothing away. "I'm sure. And for you to come all this way not knowing what you'd find, that takes courage." "Or desperation," Mrs. O'Malley added with a nervous laugh. Silence stretched for a beat too long. Then Vivian said, "I prefer to think of it as practical decision-making. We both needed something the other could provide. It's worked out well so far." "So it's a business arrangement," Mrs. Patterson's tone sharpened. "How modern." "I suppose it is." "And you're managing all right? The work must be quite different from what you're used to." Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew what Mrs. Patterson was really asking. Could this oversized Eastern woman handle real frontier work, or was she dead weight Caleb would have to carry? "I grew up around horses," Vivian said. "My father bred them. The work here is hard, but it's not unfamiliar." "I see." Mrs. Patterson paused. "We heard about the foal, that you delivered it yourself." "The mare was in distress. I did what needed doing. quite remarkable. Most women wouldn't have the stomach for that sort of thing. Vivian's laugh was dry. Most women don't have the luxury of being squeamish out here, do they? Mrs. Chen spoke up, her voice warmer than the others. I think it's wonderful that you were able to help. My husband says Caleb's breeding program is the best in the territory. It would have been a real loss if that mare had died. Thank you. I was just glad I could make a difference. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, recipes, weather patterns, whose husband had accidentally shot whose chicken. Caleb relaxed slightly. Maybe this was just a genuine welcome after all. Then Mrs. Patterson struck. You know, dear, I couldn't help but notice you've let yourself get quite a bit of sun, and your hands... A pause that somehow conveyed disapproval more effectively than words. Well, it's none of my business, of course, but a lady does need to take care of her complexion and figure, even out here. The silence that followed was ice cold. When Vivian spoke, her voice was perfectly pleasant and absolutely lethal. Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern, but I came west to work, not to maintain the appearance of someone who doesn't. If that offends your sensibilities, I'm afraid you'll have to be offended. Caleb stopped pretending to work on the harness. Mrs. Patterson sputtered. I wasn't suggesting. That is, I merely meant... You meant exactly what you said, and I've given you my answer. Vivian's tone shifted, becoming warmer but no less firm. Now, unless there's actual business to discuss, I have bread to finish and a garden that needs tending. Thank you for the preserves. They're very thoughtful. It was a dismissal delivered so smoothly that Mrs. Patterson couldn't quite call it rude, but the message was crystal clear. The visit ended shortly after. Caleb watched the wagon disappear down the road, then went inside. Vivian stood at the sink, gripping the edge hard enough that her knuckles had gone white. The preserves sat untouched on the table. You all right? Caleb asked. She didn't turn around. Fine. You don't look fine. I said I'm fine. But her voice cracked on the last word, and Caleb realized she was crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears running down her face while she stared out the window. He crossed the room without thinking, then stopped. He'd never been good at comfort. Physical affection wasn't in his vocabulary anymore. But seeing Vivian, strong, capable Vivian, standing there trying not to fall apart made something in him break. She's a bitter old woman, he said quietly. Her opinion doesn't matter. It's not just her. Vivian wiped her face roughly. It's everyone. Every person who looks at me and sees something wrong, something that needs fixing or hiding or apologizing for. I thought maybe out here it would be different. I thought maybe I could just work and be useful, and that would be enough. It is enough, is it? Because that woman just spent 30 minutes pretending to be welcoming while really telling me I'm not acceptable. That even here, in the middle of nowhere, I'm still wrong. Caleb felt anger rising in his chest. Not at Vivian, but at every person who'd ever made her feel this way. You want to know what I think? She turned to face him, her eyes red but defiant. I think Mrs. Patterson is jealous, he said. I think she came out here expecting to find you struggling, failing, needing her help and charity. Instead, she found someone who's thriving, someone who can do things she never could. And that threatened her. You're just saying that. I'm not. He took a step closer. You saved Dahlia and Hope. You've got the garden producing better than it has in years. The horses respond to you better than they ever did to me. You're not wrong, Vivian. You're exactly right. She stared at him, something vulnerable and raw in her expression. You mean that? Every word. For a moment they just stood there, the space between them charged with something Caleb couldn't name. Then Vivian nodded, squaring her shoulders in that way she had when she'd made a decision. All right, she said. Thank you. Don't thank me for telling the truth. She smiled slightly. Still, thank you. The moment passed, but something had shifted again. Another wall down, another piece of armor removed. Caleb went back outside, his mind churning. He'd meant what he said, every word, and that realization sat heavy in his gut. Because somewhere along the way, Vivian had stopped being the mail-order bride he'd sent for and started being something else entirely. Someone he cared about, someone he couldn't imagine this place without. That night, lying in bed with the usual careful space between them, Caleb spoke into the darkness. My wife died. Vivian went still, He could feel her listening. Before the war, he continued. Sarah, we were married 2 years. She got sick, fever that went through town. Killed half a dozen people before it burned out. She was one of them. Caleb, after she died, I joined up. Figured I didn't have anything worth staying for. Spent 4 years fighting, watching men die for causes they didn't understand. Came back and my brother convinced me to start over out here. Fresh start, he said. New life. He paused, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. Then he died too. Stupid accident that shouldn't have happened. And I realized everyone I let myself care about ends up gone. So I stopped. Stopped caring, stopped trying, stopped everything except the minimum needed to survive. Vivian's hand found his in the darkness. Her fingers laced through his, warm and solid. Then you showed up, Caleb said quietly, and you're making it real hard to keep not caring. She squeezed his hand. Good. That doesn't scare you? Knowing I'm broken like this? Everyone's broken, Caleb. The question is whether you're willing to let someone help put the pieces back together. She shifted closer, not much, just enough that he could feel her warmth. I'm not going anywhere. You need to understand that. I chose this. I choose it every morning when I wake up. You're not some burden I'm trapped with. You're my partner. Even though I'm terrible at talking and worse at feelings, and I still sleep with a gun under my side of the bed? Especially because of all that. There was a smile in her voice. You're real, Caleb. You don't pretend to be something you're not. Do you know how rare that is? He didn't have words for what he was feeling. Relief and terror mixed together in equal measure. So he just held her hand and let himself be held in return. They fell asleep that way, hands clasped between them like an anchor. The days blurred into weeks. July arrived with its relentless heat, and with it came new challenges. A section of fence came down during a storm, and 3 horses got out before Caleb and Vivian could repair it. They spent 2 days tracking the animals across the territory, sleeping rough under the stars and eating jerky that tasted like leather. On the second night, sitting by a small fire while the horses grazed nearby, Vivian asked the question Caleb had been dreading. Why did you really send for a bride? He poked at the fire with a stick. I told you, the ranch needed 2 people. That's not the whole truth. She was right, of course. Vivian was always right about things like this. Caleb took a breath. After my brother died, I spent about 6 months thinking maybe I should just sell the place. Move on. But I couldn't. This land, it's in my blood now. And I realized I had a choice. I could keep struggling alone and probably fail, or I could ask for help. So you wrote to the agency. I wrote drunk, at 2 a.m, fully expecting to tear up the letter in daylight. He laughed without humor. But come morning, I couldn't think of a good reason not to send it. Worst case, nobody responded. Best case, I got a partner who could help me save this place. And what did you get? He looked at her across the fire. Vivian sat with her knees drawn up, her face orange in the firelight, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked tired and dirty and completely at ease in a way he'd never seen from any woman. I got you, he said simply. Is that the best case or worst case? Still figuring that out. She threw a small stick at him. Ass. He caught it, grinning. You asked. I did. She stood, stretching. I'm going to check the horses one more time, then turn in. Vivian? She turned back. It's the best case, Caleb said quietly. In case you were wondering. Even in the dim light, he could see her smile. They found the last horse the next morning and made it back to the ranch by afternoon. Exhausted and filthy, they fell into bed without bothering with supper and slept 14 hours straight. When Caleb woke, late morning sun was streaming through the window, and Vivian was already up. He could hear her moving around in the main room, humming something under her breath. He lay there listening, feeling something dangerously close to contentment. Then he heard horses outside. Multiple horses. Caleb was up and pulling on his boots before his brain fully engaged. He grabbed the rifle from beside the bed, old habits from the war, and went to the window. Tom Bradley sat on his horse in the yard, flanked by his 2 sons. They weren't pointing weapons, but the threat was implicit in their presence. Caleb's blood went cold. He stepped outside, rifle held loose but ready. Thought I told you not to come back, Tom. Public road, Tom said. Free country. This is private property. Just came to talk. But Tom's eyes were on Vivian, who'd appeared in the doorway behind Caleb. Wanted to make you an offer, Mercer. Not interested.
You don't even know what it is. Don't care. Tom's expression hardened. I'm trying to be neighborly here. I heard you've been having trouble with your horses getting out, fences falling down. Seems like maybe this operation's too much for one man to handle. Good thing I'm not one man anymore. That woman? Tom's laugh was ugly. What's she gonna do when real trouble comes? Bake it some bread?
Vivian stepped forward before Caleb could respond. Mr. Bradley, I appreciate your concern for our well-being, but we're managing just fine. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do. I'm talking to your husband, woman. And I'm talking to you. Vivian's voice was steel wrapped in silk. Leave. Pete Bradley, the older son, leaned forward in his saddle. You got a mouth on you for someone who... The rifle was at Caleb's shoulder before Pete finished the sentence, pointed directly at his chest. Finish that thought, Caleb said quietly. Please. The yard went silent except for the wind and the nervous shifting of horses. Tom raised a hand, palm out. No need for that kind of reaction, Mercer. My boy was just making an observation. He was about to insult my wife. That's not an observation, that's a mistake. Touchy. Protective. There's a difference. Caleb kept the rifle steady. Now you've made your offer, whatever it was, and we've declined. You've got about 30 seconds to be off my property before I decide you're trespassing with intent. Tom's eyes narrowed. You're making enemies you can't afford, Mercer. Then I guess I'll deal with that when it comes. 20 seconds. For a moment, Caleb thought it was going to escalate. He could see the calculation in Tom's eyes, weighing options, considering whether to push. Then Tom spat and turned his horse. Your funeral. The Bradleys rode off at a canter, throwing dust and implied threats in equal measure. Caleb lowered the rifle slowly, his heart hammering. That was stupid, Vivian said behind him. Probably. He's going to come back, and he won't be talking next time. I know. Caleb turned to face her. But I meant what I said. Nobody talks to you like that. She studied his face, reading something there. You really would have shot him. If he'd finished that sentence, yeah, I would have. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she stepped closer and kissed him. It wasn't romantic, it was fierce and quick and tasted like coffee and fear and relief all mixed together. It was over before Caleb's brain caught up with what was happening. She pulled back, her eyes searching his. What was that for? He managed. For being willing to fight for me, even when it's stupid. She touched his face briefly. Thank you. Then she went back inside, leaving Caleb standing in the yard holding a rifle and trying to remember how to breathe. That kiss changed everything. They didn't talk about it, but it hung between them like a live wire. The careful distance they'd maintained started to collapse. Small touches became more frequent. Hands brushing while working, shoulders bumping at the dinner table, the space in bed shrinking bit by bit. Neither of them pushed. It felt too fragile for that. But one night, about a week after the Bradleys' visit, Caleb woke to find Vivian sitting up in bed, her face buried in her hands. What's wrong? His voice was rough with sleep. Nothing. Go back to sleep. But her shoulders were shaking. Caleb sat up, suddenly wide awake. Vivian? I'm fine, just a dream. He'd had enough nightmares to know that particular lie. Talk to me. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, I dreamed you sent me back. Said I wasn't good enough, wasn't what you needed. You put me on the stagecoach and I had to go back east to my aunt, and everyone looked at me with pity and I... Her voice broke. Caleb did something he hadn't done in years. He reached out and pulled her against him. She stiffened for half a second, then collapsed into him, her face pressed against his chest while she cried quietly. He held her, one hand stroking her hair, feeling completely out of his depth, but unwilling to let go. You're not going anywhere, he said into her hair. You understand me? I don't care what you dream. You're staying right here. You promise? I promise. She cried for a few more minutes, then pulled back, wiping her face. Sorry, I don't usually... Don't apologize. I'm not weak. I don't want you to think... Vivian. He waited until she looked at him. You're the strongest person I know. Having feelings doesn't change that. She laughed wetly. You barely know anyone. Point stands. They settled back down, but this time Vivian stayed close, her head on his shoulder. Caleb's arm went around her automatically, and they lay there in the darkness, listening to each other breathe. Caleb? Yeah? I'm glad I came here. Even with everything. I'm glad. His chest felt tight. Me too. They fell asleep tangled together, and when morning came, neither of them mentioned moving apart. August brought a brief respite from the heat and a visit from Doc Henderson. The old man showed up unannounced, driving his buggy with the kind of reckless speed that suggested he'd never quite grasped the concept of his own mortality. Heard you had some excitement with a foaling, he said, climbing down stiffly. Thought I'd check on the mare. Caleb led him to the barn where Dahlia and Hope were both thriving. Doc Henderson examined them both with the thoroughness that had made him the best veterinarian in 3 counties. Whoever delivered this foal knew what they were doing, he said finally. Mare's healthy, foal's developing well. You get lucky and find someone with experience? My wife did it, Caleb said, trying not to sound too proud and failing completely. Doc Henderson's eyebrows shot up. Your wife? The one from back east? That's the one. I'll be damned. The old man straightened, wincing at his back. She around? Wouldn't mind meeting someone who can pull off a breech birth without my help. Vivian was in the garden. Caleb called her over, and she came, dirt under her nails and sweat on her face, looking every inch the frontier woman she'd become. Doc Henderson shook her hand with genuine respect. Mrs. Mercer, I understand I have you to thank for keeping me from a very difficult call. Just did what needed doing, Vivian said. Don't sell yourself short. Most men would have lost that mare. He glanced between them. You two make a good team. After he left, Vivian turned to Caleb. He's a character. He's seen everything twice, and nothing surprises him anymore. Caleb paused. Except you, apparently. Is that good or bad? He caught her hand, lacing their fingers together. It's good. Everything about you is good. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. Caleb Mercer, are you getting soft on me? Maybe. Good, she said, and pulled him into a kiss that was considerably longer than the first one. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. This is real now, isn't it? He asked quietly. It's been real for a while, Vivian said. We were just too stubborn to admit it. That night, the careful space between them disappeared entirely, and Caleb Mercer, who'd spent 3 years convinced he'd never feel anything again, discovered that maybe broken things could still learn to mend. September came in soft, painting the grasslands gold and bringing cooler nights that made sleeping easier. The ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt almost comfortable, and for the first time in years, Caleb found himself thinking about the future instead of just surviving the present. But comfort, he'd learned, was usually temporary. The first snow came early that year, not the real winter snow that would bury the territory under feet of white, but a warning shot. A October morning when Caleb woke to find frost coating the windows and a thin layer of powder dusting the ground. Vivian stood at the window, wrapped in a quilt, watching the snow fall with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. You all right? He asked, coming up behind her. I've never seen snow this early. It's rare, but it happens. He put his arms around her waist, pulling her back against him. That kind of casual affection still felt foreign, but he was getting better at it. Means winter's going to be brutal. How brutal? Caleb thought about the winters he'd survived out here, the ones that killed cattle and horses, that trapped people in their homes for weeks at a time, that turned the beautiful landscape into something actively murderous. Bad enough that we need to prepare, he said carefully. Today. They spent the morning reinforcing the barn, checking supplies, making sure the woodpile was adequate. Vivian worked without complaint, but Caleb could see the worry creeping into her expression. Talk to me, he said, around noon, when they stopped to eat cold biscuits and cheese. I'm just thinking about the horses. If it gets as bad as you're saying, we'll manage. We've got the barn, plenty of hay, the creek won't freeze completely. He paused. I've done this before, Vivian. We'll be fine. You've done it alone. That's different than having someone else to worry about. The observation hit harder than she probably intended. She was right. Caleb had survived previous winters through sheer, stubborn refusal to die. He'd gone days without proper food, slept in the barn when the cabin's heat failed, pushed himself to the edge of collapse, keeping animals alive. He couldn't do that now. Not with Vivian here. We'll be smarter this time, he said finally. Both of us. She nodded, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. That night, lying in bed with the wind starting to pick up outside, Vivian asked the question that had clearly been eating at her all day. What happens if we get trapped? If it snows so bad we can't get to town for supplies? We've got enough food for 3 months if we're careful. 4 if we stretch it. The real problem is the horses. They need more than we can store. So we'd have to choose, between us and them. Caleb turned to look at her in the darkness. It won't come to that. But if it did? He thought about Dahlia, about Hope, about the other horses he'd spent years building this ranch around. Then he thought about Vivian, about losing her to starvation, or cold, or his own stupidity. We'd figure something out, he said, which wasn't really an answer. Vivian was quiet for a moment, then, I won't let you choose me over them. Those horses are your livelihood, your future. You're my future. The words came out before he could stop them, raw and honest and terrifying. Vivian's breath caught. Caleb, I mean it. I spent 3 years thinking this ranch was all I had left worth caring about. Then you showed up and turned everything upside down. He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her. So yeah, if it comes down to it, I'm choosing you. Every time. She pulled him down into a kiss that tasted like salt. Tears, though Caleb wasn't sure whose. You're an idiot, she whispered against his mouth. Probably. I love you anyway. The words hung in the air between them, huge and impossible. Caleb's chest felt too tight. Say that again. I love you, Caleb Mercer. I have for a while now. I just didn't know if... He kissed her hard enough to stop the words, pouring everything he couldn't say into it. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead to hers. I love you too, he managed. I'm terrible at saying it, but I do. Vivian laughed, shaky and relieved. We're quite a pair, aren't we? 2 broken people trying to figure out how to be whole. Maybe we don't need to be whole. Maybe broken's good enough. It is, she said. With you, it is. They made love that night with a new kind of urgency, like they were trying to prove something to themselves. Afterward, tangled together in sheets that smelled like hay and wood smoke, Caleb felt something he'd thought was dead forever. Peace. The snow melted by morning, but the warning stayed. They spent the next 2 weeks preparing in earnest. Caleb made a run to town for extra supplies, loading the wagon with flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil, anything they might need if winter came down hard. Vivian organized the cabin, creating storage where none had existed, rationing their existing stock to make room for the new. In town, Caleb ran into Sheriff Morrison outside the general store. Mercer, Morrison said, his tone neutral. The sheriff was a fair man, but he didn't waste words. Heard you had trouble with Tom Bradley. Caleb's jaw tightened. Nothing I couldn't handle. That's not what I asked. Morrison leaned against the post, his eyes sharp. Tom's been talking. Says you threatened him and his boys. Says your wife's got you all twisted up. Tom came onto my property making threats. I responded appropriately. By pointing a rifle at his son? By defending my home and my wife. There a law against that? Morrison sighed. Look, I'm not saying you were wrong. Tom Bradley's a piece of work and his boys are worse. But he's also connected, owns half the grazing land in the territory, has the ear of people in the territorial government. You keep pushing him, it's going to blow up in your face. So what do you suggest? I let him insult Vivian? Let him run roughshod over my property? I suggest you be smart. Pick your battles. Don't give him an excuse to come at you legally. Morrison straightened. Winter's coming. You got enough to worry about without adding a property dispute to the mix. Caleb knew the sheriff was right, but it still grated. Noted. I mean it, Mercer. Watch yourself. The conversation left a sour taste that lasted all the way home. When Caleb told Vivian about it that night, she listened with a frown. He's trying to help, she said finally. I know. But you hate that he's probably right. Caleb smiled without humor. You're getting good at reading me. It's not that hard. You only have about 3 expressions. She poked his chest. Stoic, annoyed, and that thing you do when you're trying not to show you're worried. I don't have a worried expression. You absolutely do. Your jaw gets tight, and you stare at the horizon like it personally offended you. That's just my face. Vivian laughed, and the tension broke. But later, lying in the dark, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that Morrison's warning was more than just friendly advice. Tom Bradley was planning something. Caleb could feel it. The question was what, and whether Caleb would see it coming in time. November arrived with wind that cut like knives and temperatures that dropped fast after sunset. The horses grew shaggy winter coats, and Caleb and Vivian fell into the harder rhythm of cold weather ranching, hauling water that wanted to freeze, breaking ice from troughs, keeping the barn warm enough that the animals didn't suffer. It was exhausting work, but they managed. Then, 3 weeks into November, Vivian got sick. It started small, fatigue that didn't go away after rest, nausea that hit at odd times. Caleb noticed she was picking at her food, that she went to bed earlier and woke later. "You feeling all right?" he asked one morning, watching her push eggs around her plate. "Fine, just tired." "You've been tired for a week." "It's the weather. Everyone gets run down when winter hits." But 2 days later, Caleb found her behind the barn, bent over and vomiting into the snow. His heart stopped. "Vivian," she held up a hand, waving him off, then straightened and wiped her mouth. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're sick." "I'm not sick." She took a shaky breath, and something in her expression made Caleb's stomach drop. "At least, not the way you're thinking." Understanding hit him like a physical blow. "You're pregnant." Vivian nodded slowly. "I think so. The timing's right, and the symptoms match what my mother described before." She stopped. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything." Caleb couldn't speak. His mind had gone completely blank except for one thought cycling on repeat. Pregnant, pregnant, pregnant. "Say something," Vivian said quietly. His voice cracked. He tried again. "How long have you known?" "Suspected? 2 weeks. But I wasn't certain until a few days ago." She was watching him carefully, trying to read his reaction. "Are you angry?" "Angry? Why would I be angry?" "Because we never discussed this. Because it's going to make everything harder. Because—" Caleb closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she made a small sound of surprise. "I'm not angry," he said into her hair. "I'm terrified. But I'm not angry." She pulled back to look at him. "Terrified?" "Vivian, women die in childbirth out here, all the time. The nearest doctor is an hour away on good roads, and winter's coming." The words tumbled out faster than he could control them. "What if something goes wrong? What if I can't get help in time? What if—" "Stop!" She put her hands on his face, forcing him to look at her. "We don't know what's going to happen. We can't control everything, but I'm strong, and I'm healthy, and women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "That doesn't make it less dangerous." "No," she agreed. "But worrying won't make it safer." Her expression softened. "I'm scared too, Caleb, but I'm also happy. Are you? At all?" Was he happy? The question cut through the panic. Caleb thought about a child, his child, Vivian's child, growing inside her. Thought about teaching a son or daughter to ride, to work the land, to be strong in the way this place demanded. Thought about family, real family, the thing he'd lost and thought he'd never have again. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm happy." The smile that broke across Vivian's face was worth every moment of terror. They held each other in the cold November air, while snow started to fall again and the wind picked up, and somewhere in the distance a horse whinnied. "We need to prepare," Caleb said finally. "Make sure we have everything you'll need. Talk to Doc Henderson. Get his advice." Caleb. "And we should probably reinforce the bedroom, make it warmer, and stock extra firewood." Caleb. He stopped. "What?" "You're spiraling." "I'm planning." "You're panicking." She kissed him gently. "We have months. We'll figure it out together, one step at a time." He wanted to argue that there wasn't enough time, that months would disappear in a blink, and then they'd be facing the most dangerous moment of both their lives with inadequate preparation. But Vivian was looking at him with such confidence, such absolute certainty that they'd manage, that he couldn't bring himself to voice his fears. "Okay," he said. "One step at a time." The first step was telling Doc Henderson. Caleb rode to town the next day, leaving Vivian with strict instructions to rest. He found the old doctor at his office, treating a rancher's dog for a cut paw. Mercer, Doc Henderson said, surprised. Everything all right with Dahlia? The horses are fine. It's Vivian. She's... Caleb stopped, realizing he'd never actually said the words out loud. She's expecting. Doc Henderson's expression shifted immediately to professional concern. How far along? 2 months, maybe closer to 3. She been eating all right, keeping food down? Some nausea, but it passes. The doctor nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. That's normal. I'll want to examine her, but it sounds like everything's progressing as it should. He paused. You worried about the winter timing? Wouldn't you be? Son, I've delivered babies in blizzards, droughts, and once during a barn fire. Nature doesn't care about convenience. He clapped Caleb on the shoulder. But I understand the concern. Your wife struck me as a strong woman when I met her. That counts for a lot. What if something goes wrong? Then we handle it, same as we handle everything else out here. Doc Henderson's expression was kind but firm. You can't control this, Caleb. Best thing you can do is make sure she's comfortable, well-fed, and not working herself to exhaustion. Let me know when she's closer, and I'll make arrangements to be available. It wasn't the reassurance Caleb wanted, but it was honest. He appreciated that. On the ride home, he passed Tom Bradley's property. The Bradley Ranch was larger than Caleb's, more established, with better buildings and more livestock. Tom was standing near his barn, talking to his sons. When he saw Caleb, Tom's expression hardened. He said something to Pete, who laughed and spat in Caleb's direction. Caleb kept riding, but his hand drifted to the rifle. Not yet, he told himself. Winter was coming. He had bigger things to worry about than Tom Bradley's wounded pride. But the feeling of being watched followed him all the way home. Vivian was in the kitchen when he got back, kneading bread dough despite his instructions to rest. You're supposed to be taking it easy, he said. I am taking it easy. This is easy. She shaped the dough into a loaf. What did the doctor say? Caleb relayed the conversation, watching relief cross her face. See? We're going to be fine. You don't know that. Neither do you. So we might as well believe the better option. She washed her hands and turned to face him. Caleb, I need you to trust that I can handle this. I'm not fragile. The baby's not making me helpless. I know that. Do you? Because you're looking at me like I'm about to break. He hadn't realized he was doing it. Caleb consciously relaxed his expression. Sorry, I'm trying not to be overprotective. Yeah, it's sweet, in small doses. She crossed to him, taking his hands. But I'm still me. I can still work, still help with the ranch. I need that, Caleb. I need to feel useful. You are useful. He struggled for words. You're everything. The statement hung between them, raw and true. Vivian's eyes shone. Keep saying things like that, and I'm going to get spoiled. Good. They spent the evening planning for the baby, turning the small storage area off the bedroom into a nursery, discussing supplies they'd need, arguing about names. It felt surreal and terrifying, and more right than anything Caleb had experienced in years. But that night, the first real storm hit. It came in fast, temperature dropping 30 degrees in an hour, wind screaming across the plains like something alive and angry. Snow fell so thick Caleb couldn't see the barn from the cabin window. We need to check the horses, he said, pulling on his coat. I'm coming with you. Vivian, don't. I know that barn as well as you do, and you'll need help if something's wrong. She was right, and there wasn't time to argue. They tied a rope between the cabin and barn, an old trick to keep from getting lost in whiteout conditions, and fought their way across the yard. The wind tried to tear them apart, snow stinging exposed skin like needles. Inside the barn, the horses were restless but safe. Caleb and Vivian worked quickly, checking each animal, distributing extra hay, making sure water troughs weren't freezing. This is just the start, Caleb shouted over the wind. It's going to get worse. Vivian nodded, her face already red from cold. They made it back to the cabin as the storm intensified. For 3 days, it raged without stopping. Caleb made trips to the barn every few hours, fighting through conditions that would have killed a man who didn't know the land. Vivian kept the fire going, rationed their food, melted snow for water when the pump froze. They worked as a team, neither complaining, both understanding that survival out here was a choice you made every single day. On the third night, huddled together for warmth, while the cabin groaned under the wind,
Vivian spoke into the darkness. My aunt used to say I'd never survive out here, that I was too soft, too sheltered. She was wrong. I wanted to prove her wrong. That's part of why I came, to show everyone back east that I was more than they thought. She paused. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about them. It became about me, about building something real.
Caleb tightened his arms around her.
You've built something real. We both have.
Yeah, she said softly. We have. The storm finally broke on the fourth morning. Caleb woke to silence. The absence of wind so complete it was almost louder than the noise had been. Outside, the world was buried under 3 feet of snow. It took them most of the day to dig out the barn, to clear paths, to assess damage. 2 sections of fence had come down. The chicken coop's roof had partially collapsed. The vegetable garden was completely destroyed, but the horses were alive. The cabin had held. They had food and fuel. They'd survived. First storm of the season, Caleb said, surveying the damage. There'll be more. We'll handle them. Vivian wasn't asking. Yeah, he agreed, we will. But that night, lying in bed with Vivian's head on his chest and one hand resting on her still flat stomach, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. The storm had been a test, and whatever came next was going to be worse. He just didn't know how much worse until 2 weeks later, when he woke to find the barn on fire. The smell hit him first, smoke, acrid and wrong, then the light, orange and flickering through the bedroom window. Caleb was moving before he was fully awake, pulling on boots and coat, grabbing buckets. What's happening? Vivian sat up, confused. Barn's on fire, stay here. Like hell! But he was already gone, running through snow that grabbed at his boots, his heart hammering with terror. The barn's far end was engulfed, flames eating through old wood like it was paper. Inside, the horses were screaming. Caleb threw open the doors and ran into smoke and heat and chaos. The horses were panicking, throwing themselves against stalls, eyes rolling white with fear. He started releasing them, one after another, slapping their hindquarters to drive them out into the snow. Stella fought him, too scared to think straight. Caleb grabbed her halter and physically dragged her toward the exit. Smoke was filling his lungs. The heat was unbearable. He got Stella out and turned back for the others. That's when he saw Vivian. She was in Dahlia's stall, working the latch with shaking hands while the mare reared and struck at the walls. Hope was already loose, following her mother's panic. Get out, Caleb shouted. Not without them. The stall door gave way. Dahlia bolted, nearly trampling Vivian in her rush for safety. Vivian stumbled, caught herself, reached for Hope. The barn roof groaned. Time slowed. Caleb saw it happening, the beam starting to give way, the angle of the fall, Vivian directly beneath it. He didn't think, he just moved. Caleb hit Vivian at a full run, tackling her sideways. They went down hard in the snow just outside the barn door as the beam crashed down exactly where she'd been standing. For a moment, they just lay there, coughing and gasping. Then Vivian started laughing. It was hysteric, edged with shock, but it was laughter. You tackled me, she managed between coughs. You were about to die. I know, thank you. She rolled to face him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes streaming from smoke. We're a mess. Yeah, Caleb agreed. Behind them, the barn continued to burn. But the horses were safe. He could see them scattered across the snow, wild-eyed but alive. Vivian gripped his hand. This wasn't an accident. I know. Someone did this. Caleb stared at the burning barn, at 3 years of work going up in flames, and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Yeah, he said quietly. Someone did. And he had a pretty good idea who. They stood watching the barn burn until there was nothing left to save. The sky was turning gray with dawn by the time the flames died down to smoldering embers, and Caleb's entire body felt like it had been beaten with hammers. Every breath hurt from the smoke he'd inhaled. His hands were blistered from hot wood and metal. But Vivian was alive. The horses were alive. That had to be enough. We need to round up the horses, Vivian said, her voice hoarse. She hadn't stopped coughing since they'd gotten out. Before they scatter too far. You need to rest. I'm fine. You're pregnant, and you almost just died, and you're standing here in soaked clothes and freezing temperatures. Caleb's voice came out harsher than he intended. Go inside, get warm. I'll handle the horses. For a moment he thought she'd argue. Then she nodded, swaying slightly on her feet. Caleb caught her elbow. You sure you're all right? Just tired, and my chest hurts. Mine too. It's the smoke. He guided her toward the cabin. Get out of those wet clothes. Drink water. I'll be back as soon as I can. She went without further protest, which worried him more than anything else could have. Rounding up the horses took 3 hours. They'd scattered across the property in their panic, and the snow made tracking them difficult. Caleb found Stella nearly half a mile away, standing alone and shivering. Dahlia and Hope were together near the creek, the mare keeping her foal close. The others had clustered near the windbreak of cottonwoods on the east boundary. By the time Caleb had them all corralled in the south pasture, the only area with intact fencing, the sun was fully up and his exhaustion had crossed into something dangerous. He'd been awake for over 24 hours, half of that fighting a fire and hauling panicked animals through snow. But he couldn't rest yet. He walked the perimeter of the burned barn, studying what remained. The structure was a total loss, just blackened posts and collapsed walls. But it was the way it had burned that held Caleb's attention. The fire had started at the far end, away from the house, away from where a dropped lantern or kicked-over heater would naturally be. And when he dug through the debris near the origin point, Caleb found what he was looking for. A can. Partially melted, but still recognizable. Kerosene. Nobody kept kerosene stored in that part of the barn. Caleb's fuel was kept near the door in clearly marked containers, and he checked them obsessively because fire was every rancher's nightmare. This can had been brought in from outside. Deliberately placed, deliberately lit. Caleb straightened, the can hanging from his burned hand, and looked toward the road. Tom Bradley had finally made his move. Inside the cabin, Vivian had managed to change into dry clothes before collapsing on the bed. She was asleep when Caleb came in, her breathing rough but steady. He stood watching her for a long moment, feeling rage and fear war inside his chest. Someone had tried to kill them, had tried to burn them alive in their own barn, or at minimum destroy their livelihood completely. And Caleb knew with absolute certainty that Sheriff Morrison wouldn't do anything about it. There was no proof Tom Bradley had set the fire personally. The kerosene can was evidence of arson, but not of who'd done it. And Tom had money, connections, influence. Caleb had nothing but his word and a burned barn. He set the can on the table and sat down heavily. His hands were shaking, from exhaustion, from shock, from the adrenaline finally wearing off. What was he supposed to do now? The barn was gone. Winter was here. They had 15 horses and nowhere to shelter them. Their feed supply had been in the barn. Most of it was destroyed. Without a barn, they couldn't breed horses next spring, couldn't protect stock through the worst weather, couldn't survive as a working ranch. Tom Bradley had known exactly where to hit them. Caleb put his head in his hands and let himself feel the full weight of it. He must have dozed off at the table because Vivian's hand on his shoulder jerked him awake. The light through the window said it was past noon. "Hey," she said softly. "How long have you been sitting here?" "Don't know." His voice came out like gravel. "How are you feeling?" "Like I swallowed a campfire, but I'll live." She saw the kerosene can on the table and her expression hardened. "You found evidence." "Yeah." "What are you going to do about it?" Caleb looked up at her. Vivian's face was still smudged with soot, her hair a mess, her eyes red from smoke. But there was steel in her expression that said she was ready to fight. "I don't know," he admitted. "Going to the sheriff won't do anything. Bradley's too connected. So we just let him get away with it?" "I didn't say that." Vivian pulled out the other chair and sat down across from him. "Talk to me. What are you thinking?" What was he thinking? That he wanted to ride to the Bradley ranch and put a bullet in Tom's head? That he wanted to burn their property the way they'd burned his? That violence was calling to him the way it had during the war, when solving problems with a gun had been not just acceptable, but expected. But he wasn't that man anymore. Or he was trying not to be. "I'm thinking we need to survive the winter first," he said finally. "Then we figure out how to handle Bradley. The horses can shelter in the lean-to on the south pasture. It's not ideal, but it'll keep the worst weather off them. We'll move what feed we salvaged, supplement with what we can buy in town. That's going to cost money we don't have." "I know." Caleb rubbed his face. "I've got a little saved, enough to get us through if we're careful." "And in the spring?" In the spring, we rebuild. Bigger barn, better layout, proper fire breaks. He met her eyes. We don't let Bradley win. Vivian reached across the table and took his damaged hands in hers, careful of the blisters. We're going to make it through this. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Because giving up isn't in either of our vocabularies. She squeezed gently. We've survived everything else thrown at us. We'll survive this too. Caleb wanted to believe her. He was just so tired of fighting. But looking at Vivian, strong, stubborn Vivian, who'd followed him into a burning barn without hesitation, he found himself nodding. Yeah, he said, we will. The next week was brutal. They worked from before dawn until after dark, moving horses, salvaging what they could from the barn wreckage, reinforcing the lean-to shelter. The weather didn't cooperate. 2 more storms rolled through, each dumping fresh snow and dropping temperatures to dangerous lows. Caleb made a trip to town for supplies and found the whole place talking about the fire. Most people offered sympathy. A few offered help, materials for rebuilding, offers to stable horses temporarily. Caleb accepted what he could afford to repay and politely declined the rest. Tom Bradley was conspicuously absent from town that day. Sheriff Morrison pulled Caleb aside outside the general store. Heard about your barn, Morrison said. That's rough. It is. Any idea how it started? Caleb studied the sheriff's face, trying to determine if this was genuine inquiry or political theater. Morrison's expression gave nothing away. I have theories, Caleb said carefully. I'm sure you do, but theories aren't evidence. Morrison leaned against the hitching post. You planning to do anything about those theories? What would you suggest, Sheriff, since evidence seems to be in short supply? I'd suggest you focus on rebuilding and let the law handle the rest. The law doesn't seem particularly interested in handling anything. Morrison's jaw tightened. You think I don't know what probably happened? You think I don't know Tom Bradley's capable of this kind of thing? He kept his voice low. But knowing and proving are different animals, Mercer, and I can't arrest a man based on your suspicions, no matter how well-founded they might be. So he just gets away with it. I didn't say that. I said I can't arrest him. Yet. Morrison straightened. But if you go after him yourself, if you take this into your own hands, then I'll have to arrest you. And that won't help your wife or your ranch or that baby she's carrying. Caleb's head snapped up. How did you? Small town, Mercer. Word travels. Morrison's expression softened slightly. Look, I know you're angry. You've got every right to be, but you've got more to lose now than just yourself. Think about that before you do something stupid. The sheriff walked away, leaving Caleb standing in the snow with his supplies and his rage and the uncomfortable knowledge that Morrison was right. Vivian was waiting when he got home, standing in the cabin doorway despite the cold. Everyone in town knows I'm pregnant, Caleb said, unloading the wagon. I figured they would eventually. Small places are like that. She didn't seem bothered. Did anyone say anything terrible? Not to my face. Then I'll consider it a win. She helped him carry supplies inside. Morrison talked to you? How did you? He's the sheriff. Of course he talked to you. Vivian set down a sack of flour. What did he say? Caleb relayed the conversation. Vivian listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. He's not wrong, she said when Caleb finished. I know. But you're still angry. Wouldn't you be? I am angry. I'm furious. Vivian's hands clenched at her sides. Someone tried to kill us, Caleb, tried to burn us alive or destroy everything we've built. And there's nothing we can do about it legally. So what do we do? She was quiet for a moment. Then, we survive. We rebuild. We make this ranch so successful that Tom Bradley chokes on his jealousy every time he looks our way. That's how we win. That's not justice. No, Vivian agreed, but it's better than getting you arrested or killed trying to get revenge. She moved closer, putting her hands on his chest. I need you alive, Caleb. Our baby needs you alive. The ranch needs you alive. Is that enough reason to let this go? It should have been. Caleb knew it should have been. But the rage sat in his gut like hot coals, refusing to cool. I'll try, he said finally. That's all I'm asking. December came in hard, bringing the kind of cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. The horses huddled in the lean-to, their winter coats thick and shaggy. Caleb and Vivian spent hours each day hauling water, distributing feed, checking for frostbite and injury. Vivian's pregnancy was starting to show. just a small swell beneath her loose dresses, but visible if you knew to look. She moved more carefully now, tired more easily, but she refused to stop working completely. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she said when Caleb tried to take over mucking stalls. "You shouldn't be doing heavy labor." "Neither should you with those burned hands, but here we are." She kept shoveling. "We're in this together, remember?" They were. But watching her work while carrying his child made Caleb's chest tight with worry he couldn't articulate. One morning in mid-December, Vivian woke him before dawn. "Something's wrong with Hope," she said. They dressed quickly and went to the lean-to. The young filly was standing apart from the other horses, head down, favoring her right foreleg. Caleb approached slowly, talking soft nonsense the way Vivian had taught him. Hope let him examine her leg without much fuss. When he felt along the cannon bone, she flinched. "Fracture?" Vivian asked, her face pale. "Maybe. Or a bad strain," Caleb straightened. "Either way, she needs the vet." "In this weather? The roads?" "I know." The roads were buried under snow and ice. Getting to town would take hours, assuming it was even possible. Getting Doc Henderson back here would take hours more. And if it was a fracture, Hope might not have that kind of time. Vivian was already making the decision. Caleb could see it in her face. "I can splint it," she said, "the way my father taught me. It's not perfect, but it might hold until we can get proper help." "You sure?" "No, but it's better than doing nothing." They worked together in the freezing pre-dawn darkness, Vivian's hands steady despite the cold, as she fashioned a splint from wood and cloth. Hope stood remarkably still, like she understood they were trying to help. When it was done, Vivian stepped back, examining her work. "It'll do," she said finally. "We'll need to keep her still, watch for swelling, make sure the splint doesn't shift." "You did good." She looked at him, exhaustion and worry etched in her features. "I hope so. If I'm wrong, if it's worse than I think, then we'll deal with it. But right now, you gave her a chance. That's all anyone can do." They stood in the lean-to as dawn broke, watching Hope test the splinted leg carefully. The filly was uncomfortable but stable. Small victories, Caleb thought. They were living on small victories now. That afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Caleb saw them coming from a distance, 2 wagons moving slowly through the snow. For a moment, his hand went to his rifle, thinking it might be the Bradleys coming back to finish what they'd started. Then he recognized the lead wagon. Mrs. Chen from town, with her husband driving. The second wagon held the O'Malleys. Caleb and Vivian went out to meet them. "We heard about the barn," Mrs. Chen said without preamble, "and we figured you could use some help." The wagons were loaded with lumber, nails, tools, and supplies. "We can't pay for this," Caleb said, his throat tight. "We're not asking you to." Mr. Chen was a quiet man, but his expression was firm. "We're new to this territory, but we know what it means when neighbors help each other. You do the same for us." Caleb didn't know what to say. Vivian stepped forward. "Thank you. This means more than you know." They spent the rest of the day working together, the 4 of them plus Caleb and Vivian laying the foundation for a new barn. It wouldn't be done today, or even this week, but it was a start. As the sun set and the Chens and O'Malleys prepared to leave, Mrs. Chen pulled Vivian aside. "That woman who came with me before," she said quietly. "Mrs. Patterson, don't listen to her. She's bitter because her own life didn't turn out how she wanted, and she takes it out on anyone who seems happy." Vivian smiled. "Thank you for saying that. I mean it. You're doing good here, both of you." Mrs. Chen glanced at Vivian's stomach. "And congratulations. Babies are blessings, no matter when they come." After they left, Caleb and Vivian stood looking at the barn foundation in the fading light. "People surprised me today," Vivian said. "Me too. Maybe we're not as alone as we thought." Caleb put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Maybe not." But that night, lying in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was still coming. The fire had been Tom Bradley's opening move. Men like that didn't stop until they got what they wanted or until someone stopped them. And Caleb was running out of patience for waiting. The next morning brought news that made everything worse. Sheriff Morrison rode out personally, his face grim. "Tom Bradley filed a complaint," Morrison said without preamble. "Says you've been trespassing on his property. threatening him and his sons, trying to intimidate him. Caleb's hands clenched. That's a lie. I know it's a lie. You know it's a lie. But he's got 2 witnesses, his sons, backing up his story. And he's asking for a restraining order to keep you away from his land. He burned my barn, which you can't prove. Morrison looked tired. I'm sorry, Mercer. I'm doing what I can, but Bradley's pushing the territorial judge for action. You need to be smart about this. Don't give him any ammunition. After Morrison left, Vivian found Caleb in the half-built barn, gripping a support beam so hard his knuckles were white. He's trying to provoke you, she said quietly. He wants you to do something stupid so he can have you arrested. Or killed. I know. So you're not going to do anything stupid. I said I know. Caleb's voice came out harsher than intended. He took a breath, forcing himself to calm down. I'm not going to do anything. I'll stay here, work on the barn, take care of the horses. I'll be the perfect law-abiding citizen. Vivian studied his face. You're lying. I'm not. You're lying to me, or you're lying to yourself. Maybe both. She moved closer. Caleb, I need you to hear me. Whatever you're planning, whatever you're thinking about doing, it's not worth it. We can survive Bradley. We can rebuild, but I can't survive losing you. You won't lose me. You don't know that. If you go after him, if you confront him, one of you is going to end up dead. And even if it's him, even if you win, you'll hang for it. Her voice cracked. Is that what you want? To leave me alone with a baby in a half-built ranch? The words hit like physical blows. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding tight. I'm sorry. You're right. I'm sorry. Promise me, Vivian said against his chest. Promise me you won't do anything. He wanted to promise. He wanted to mean it. I promise, Caleb said. And he told himself it wasn't a lie. Christmas came and went quietly. They had no decorations, no special food, nothing that marked the day as different from any other. But Vivian made a small cake with their dwindling sugar supply, and they ate it by lamplight while snow fell outside. Next year will be better, Vivian said, her hand resting on her rounded stomach. We'll have the baby. The barn will be done. Maybe things will be easier. Maybe, Caleb agreed, though he didn't believe it. The new year arrived with a blizzard that lasted 4 days. They were trapped in the cabin, venturing out only to care for the horses. The lean-to held, but barely. 3 of the older horses developed respiratory problems from the cold and damp. Hope's leg was healing, but slowly. And Vivian was getting bigger, more uncomfortable, moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo. On January 5th, Caleb woke to find Vivian standing at the window, crying silently. What's wrong? He was at her side immediately. Is it the baby? No, the baby's fine. She wiped her face. I miss my father. He would have loved this, the ranch, the horses, you. He would have been a good grandfather. Caleb held her while she cried, feeling helpless in the face of grief he couldn't fix. Tell me about him, he said finally. So she did. Vivian talked about her father for hours. His love of horses, his quiet strength, the way he'd treated her like a person instead of a problem. The way he'd taught her everything he knew, never once suggesting she should want something different because she was a woman. He died thinking I'd be taken care of, Vivian said, that my aunt would find me a good husband, that I'd have an easy life. You think he'd be disappointed? No. I think he'd understand. She looked around the cabin, small, rough, nothing like the comfortable house she'd grown up in. He always said the right life wasn't the easy one. It was the one you chose for yourself. Then you chose right. She smiled through tears. Yeah, I did. Late January brought a warm spell that fooled everyone into thinking winter might release its grip early. The snow melted into muddy slush, and for 3 days the temperature hovered just above freezing. Caleb used the time to work on the barn, making real progress with help from the O'Malleys and a few other neighbors who stopped by. Then, on the 4th day, Vivian went into town alone. Caleb was on the barn roof when she left, securing shingles. She'd said something about needing fabric for the baby, things they couldn't order through the general store. He'd offered to go with her, but she'd insisted she could manage the short trip alone. He should have insisted harder. Vivian was gone 3 hours before Caleb started to worry. The trip to town and back should have taken 90 minutes at most. He was saddling his horse when he heard the wagon. Vivian was driving, but something was wrong with the way she held the reins. too stiff, too controlled. Caleb was running before the wagon stopped. What happened? Vivian's face was pale, her jaw clenched. I'm fine. You're not fine. What happened? She climbed down from the wagon carefully, and that's when Caleb saw it, the rip in her coat, the bruise forming on her cheekbone, the way she was favoring her left side. Who did this? His voice came out deadly quiet. Caleb.
Who did this? Vivian met his eyes. Pete Bradley. He was in town, saw me alone, started making comments, got too close. I pushed him away and he... She touched her cheek. It's not as bad as it looks. The world narrowed to a single point of white-hot rage. Where is he? Caleb was already moving toward his horse. Vivian grabbed his arm. No, don't. That's exactly what they want, for you to lose control so they can have you arrested. He put his hands on you, on my pregnant wife. I know, and it was terrifying and humiliating, and I want him to pay for it too. Her grip tightened. But not this way. Not if it means losing you. I can't just... Yes, you can. You can stay here with me. You can help me inside. You can make sure the baby's okay. Her voice broke. Please, Caleb, I need you here, not in jail, not dead. Here. It took everything Caleb had to stop moving, to unclench his fists, to breathe through the rage threatening to consume him. Okay, he finally managed. Okay. He helped Vivian inside, his hands shaking with suppressed violence. Once she was settled, he examined her carefully. The bruise was ugly but superficial. Her ribs were tender but not broken. The baby was moving normally. I'm all right, Vivian kept saying. Really? But she wasn't all right. Caleb could see it in her eyes, the fear she was trying to hide, the violation of safety she'd felt. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that his promise to her was breaking. Because some things couldn't be forgiven. And some men needed to be stopped. That night, Caleb didn't sleep. He lay beside Vivian, listening to her breathe, watching shadows move across the ceiling while rage and helplessness fought for dominance in his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Pete Bradley's hands on her, saw the bruise on her face, saw the fear she'd tried to hide. Around 3 a.m, Vivian stirred. You're still awake, she said quietly. Can't sleep. She rolled to face him, wincing slightly at the movement. You're planning something. I'm not. Caleb. He looked at her in the darkness. What do you want me to say? That I'm fine with what happened? That I'm just going to let it go? I want you to say you'll keep your promise, that you won't do anything that'll get you killed or arrested. He hurt you, Vivian. He put his hands on you while you're carrying our child. What kind of man would I be if I just... Alive, she interrupted. You'd be alive and here with me. That's the kind of man I need you to be. Caleb sat up, running his hands through his hair. The cabin felt too small suddenly, like the walls were closing in. I don't know how to do this. How to just accept it. Vivian sat up too, moving carefully. You think I've accepted it? I'm terrified, Caleb, terrified that he'll come back, that they'll escalate, that one day you'll ride to town and won't come home. Her voice shook. But I'm more terrified of losing you to your own anger, of watching you throw everything away for revenge. It's not revenge. It's protection. It's both. And only one of those things ends well. She took his hand. Please, I'm begging you. Don't go after them. Caleb wanted to promise again, wanted to mean it this time, but the words wouldn't come. I'll try, he said finally. It wasn't enough. He could see that in Vivian's face. But she didn't push, just squeezed his hand and lay back down. Neither of them slept the rest of the night. The next day, Sheriff Morrison showed up again. This time, he wasn't alone. He had Pete Bradley with him. Caleb was working on the barn when they rode up. He straightened slowly, his hand moving toward the rifle leaning against the wall. Don't, Morrison said sharply. I'm here on official business, Mercer. Keep your hands where I can see them. What's he doing here? Caleb nodded toward Pete, who sat his horse with a smirk that made Caleb's blood boil. Mr. Bradley has filed charges. Says your wife attacked him in town yesterday. The world stopped. That's a lie, Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. He's got witnesses. 3 men who say they saw Mrs. Mercer strike him without provocation. He assaulted her. She's got a bruise on her face to prove it. Pete spoke up.
his voice carrying that same mocking tone he'd used at the ranch. "She came at me, Sheriff. I was just defending myself. Can't help it if she's clumsy and fell after." Caleb was moving before he realized it, crossing the distance between them in 3 strides. Morrison's horse shifted nervously, but the sheriff got between them before Caleb could reach Pete. "That's enough!" Morrison shoved Caleb back. "You lay a hand on him and I'll arrest you right now." "He's lying." "Then let the law sort it out." Morrison's expression was pained. "I need to talk to your wife, Mercer. Get her side of the story." Vivian had appeared in the cabin doorway. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the bruise on her face, darker now than it had been yesterday. "Mrs. Mercer," Morrison called, "I need to ask you some questions about yesterday's incident in town." Vivian walked over slowly, her hand resting on her stomach in that protective gesture pregnant women made. When she reached them, she looked Pete Bradley directly in the eye. "Ask your questions, Sheriff." Morrison did, his tone professional but not unkind. Vivian recounted the incident clearly. How Pete had cornered her outside the general store, made vulgar comments about her body, grabbed her arm when she tried to walk away. How she'd pushed him off and he'd struck her, then claimed she'd attacked him when people came running. Pete's smirk never wavered. "That's not how I remember it, Sheriff. Like I said, she came at me. I barely touched her." "The bruise on her face says different," Caleb growled. "Could have gotten that anywhere. Maybe her husband gave it to her." Pete's eyes gleamed with malice. Wouldn't be the first time a man took his temper out on his wife. Caleb lunged. This time Morrison wasn't fast enough to stop him. Caleb's fist connected with Pete's jaw, sending him stumbling backward off his horse. He landed hard in the mud, and Caleb was on him before he could get up, landing another punch that split Pete's lip. "Mercer, stop!" Morrison grabbed Caleb from behind, hauling him off. "That's assault. I'm taking you in. He hit my wife. And now you've hit him, in front of a witness." Morrison twisted Caleb's arms behind his back. "You just gave them exactly what they wanted." The truth of it hit like cold water. Caleb stopped fighting, his chest heaving. Pete was on the ground, blood running from his mouth, that smirk replaced by genuine fury. "You're going to pay for that," Pete said, spitting blood. "You and that fat cow you married." Caleb lunged again, but Morrison's grip held firm. "Enough!" The sheriff's voice cracked like a whip. "Bradley, get on your horse and get out of here before I arrest you for being an idiot. Mercer, you're coming with me." "Caleb, no!" Vivian's voice was shaking. "It's all right," Caleb said, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'll sort this out." But looking at Vivian's face, seeing the fear and resignation there, Caleb knew he'd just made everything worse. Morrison kept Caleb in the Benson's Ridge jail for 2 days. It wasn't a real cell, just a storage room with a lock. But it might as well have been prison. Every minute away from Vivian, away from the ranch during the most dangerous part of winter, felt like torture. On the second evening, Morrison came in with a tray of food. "Pete Bradley's not pressing charges," he said without preamble. Caleb looked up from where he'd been sitting against the wall. "What?" His father talked him out of it. Probably realized that having you arrested would make them look weak, like they needed the law to handle their problems. Morrison set down the tray. "You're free to go." "Just like that?" "Just like that." "But Mercer, listen to me." Morrison crouched down to eye level. "This is your last chance. You come after them again, I won't be able to protect you. Tom Bradley's already talking to the territorial judge about getting you removed from your property as a threat to public safety. He can't do that. He can try, and with enough money and the right connections, he might succeed." Morrison stood. "Go home to your wife, finish that barn, have your baby. Live your life, that's the best revenge you can get." Caleb wanted to argue, but 2 days away from Vivian had clarified something. Morrison was right. Every time Caleb let his anger control him, he played into Bradley's hands. He had to be smarter. "I understand," Caleb said. Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Your wife's outside with the wagon. She's been here every day, waiting." Vivian was sitting on the wagon bench, bundled against the cold. When she saw Caleb, relief flooded her face. She climbed down carefully and walked into his arms. "I'm sorry," Caleb said into her hair. "I'm so sorry." "I know. Let's just go home." The ride back was quiet. Caleb kept looking at Vivian, noting the exhaustion in her face, the way her hands trembled slightly on the reins. "Are you all right?" he asked. "The baby?"
We're fine, just tired. She glanced at him, and scared. Caleb, we can't keep doing this. We can't keep letting them provoke us. I know. Do you? Because you keep saying that, but then something happens and you lose control. He called you. Caleb stopped, his jaw clenching. I know what he called me. I've been called worse. Vivian's voice was steady. Words don't matter, Caleb. Not when compared to losing everything we've built. She was right. Caleb knew she was right. But somewhere deep inside, in the part of him that had survived war and loss and 3 years of lonely grief, violence still felt like the only answer that made sense. February brought more snow and news that changed everything. Tom Bradley's oldest son, Pete, was found dead in a ravine 5 miles from the Bradley ranch. His horse had thrown him during a storm, and by the time they found him, he'd frozen to death. The news hit Benson's Ridge like a thunderclap. Caleb heard it from Mr. Chen, who stopped by to help with the barn. The moment Chen said the words, Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. When did it happen? He asked. 3 days ago, during that last big storm. They just found him yesterday. 3 days ago, Caleb had been in jail, locked up with Morrison as a witness to his whereabouts. But that wouldn't matter to Tom Bradley. That wouldn't matter to a father who'd just lost his son. This is going to get bad, Caleb said. Chen nodded grimly. Watch yourself, Mercer. Tom Bradley's not a rational man on the best of days. With his boy dead, he's going to be looking for someone to blame. After Chen left, Caleb told Vivian. She listened silently, one hand on her swollen belly. She was 7 months along now, heavy with their child, moving slowly and carefully. He's going to blame you, she said finally. I know. Even though you were in jail, even though you couldn't have had anything to do with it. Doesn't matter. Bradley's been looking for an excuse to come after us completely. This'll be it. Vivian was quiet for a moment. What do we do? Caleb looked around the cabin, at the home they'd built together, the life they'd created from nothing. Then he looked at Vivian, at the woman who'd fought beside him through fire and fear and every hardship the frontier could throw at them. We prepare, he said, and we don't back down. Tom Bradley came at dawn 4 days later. Caleb was already awake, had been for hours, watching the road with the rifle across his knees. He'd known this was coming. The only question had been when. There were 6 of them, Tom, his remaining son Marcus, and 4 ranch hands. They rode straight up to the cabin and stopped. Tom looked like he'd aged 10 years. His face was haggard, his eyes hollow with grief and rage. Mercer, he called, get out here. Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle visible but not aimed. Bradley, you killed my boy. I was in jail when Pete died. Sheriff Morrison will confirm that. You had someone do it, or you set things in motion before you got arrested. Tom's voice was raw. My son is dead because of you. Your son is dead because he rode out in a blizzard and got thrown from his horse. That's tragedy, but it's not murder. You're a liar. Behind Caleb, the cabin door opened. Vivian stepped out, moving carefully, her pregnancy obvious even under her heavy coat. Mr. Bradley, she said quietly, I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but my husband had nothing to do with Pete's death. Tom's eyes focused on her, and something ugly crossed his face. You. This all started because of you, coming out here, making Mercer think he was better than his station. My boy would be alive if you'd stayed back east where you belong. That's enough, Caleb said, his voice hard. It's not near enough. You took my son. I'm taking everything from you. Tom gestured to his men. Burn it, all of it. The barn, the cabin, everything. The ranch hands shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Mr. Bradley, one of them said carefully, that's arson. I don't care what it is. Do it. Nobody moved. Tom pulled his pistol, pointing it at the reluctant ranch hand. I said do it. Put the gun down, Tom. Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through the tension. He rode in from the east, flanked by 2 deputies. This ends now. Tom's hand shook. He killed Pete. Pete died in an accident. You know that. I know that. Everyone here knows that. Morrison dismounted slowly. But what you're doing right now, that's attempted arson and assault with a deadly weapon. I will arrest you if you don't stand down. You work for me. I work for the law. Morrison's tone was iron. And right now the law says you're in the wrong. Put the gun down.
For a moment, Caleb thought Tom would shoot anyway. The grief and rage in the older man's eyes was overwhelming, irrational, dangerous. Then Tom's hand dropped. The pistol fell into the snow, and Tom Bradley collapsed. He didn't fall, just seemed to fold in on himself, shoulders shaking with sobs. Morrison caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him gently. "Get him home," Morrison told the ranch hands. "And someone fetch Doc Henderson. This man needs help." As they loaded Tom onto a horse, Marcus Bradley met Caleb's eyes. The younger man looked exhausted and scared. "This isn't over," Marcus said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Yeah," Caleb said quietly. "It is." After they left, Morrison approached the porch. "You all right?" he asked. "We're fine." Morrison looked at Vivian, concern in his expression. "Mrs. Mercer, you shouldn't be out in this cold." "I'm tougher than I look, Sheriff." He smiled slightly. "I'm starting to realize that." The smile faded. "Tom Bradley's broken. I don't think he'll come after you again, but just in case, I'll be keeping a close eye on their property for a while." "Thank you," Vivian said. After Morrison left, Caleb and Vivian went inside. They stood in the warm cabin, holding each other, feeling the weight of everything they'd survived. "Is it really over?" Vivian asked. "I think so." She pulled back to look at him. "What Tom said about me. Did you?" "No." Caleb cupped her face gently. "None of this was your fault. You hear me? Not the fire, not Pete's death, nothing. Tom's a broken man looking for someone to blame because the truth that sometimes terrible things just happen is too hard to accept. I still feel responsible. Don't. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, to this place. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth your concern." Vivian leaned into him, her head on his chest. "I love you. I love you too." They stood there as morning light filled the cabin, and for the first time in months, Caleb felt something like peace. March brought the first hints of spring and complications with Vivian's pregnancy. She'd been having pains for 2 days, nothing regular, but sharp enough to make her gasp and clutch her stomach. Doc Henderson made the trip out to examine her. "Baby's positioned wrong," he said after the examination. "Breech, like that foal you delivered. It might turn on its own, but if it doesn't, the birth's going to be difficult." Caleb's blood ran cold. How difficult? Could lose the mother, the child, or both if we're not careful? Henderson saw Caleb's expression and softened his tone. "But we've got time. Baby's not due for another 6 weeks. Plenty of time for it to turn, and even if it doesn't, I've delivered breech babies before. She's strong and healthy. That counts for a lot." After the doctor left, Caleb found Vivian sitting on the bed, hands on her stomach, face pale. "You heard?" she asked. "I heard." "I'm scared, Caleb." He sat beside her, pulling her close. "Me too. What if something goes wrong? What if—" "Then we handle it. Together." He took her hand. "You've survived everything this place has thrown at you. You're not giving up now." "I don't want to die." The words were so simple, so honest, they broke something in Caleb's chest. "You're not going to die. I won't let you." It was an empty promise, and they both knew it. Some things were beyond anyone's control. But Vivian squeezed his hand and nodded anyway. "Okay." The weeks that followed were the hardest of Caleb's life. Watching Vivian move through each day, growing more uncomfortable, more frightened, knowing there was nothing he could do to fix it. It was worse than any war, any loss, any hardship he'd endured. The barn was finally finished in early April, complete with fire breaks and better ventilation. Neighbors came to help raise the final walls, and when it was done, Caleb stood looking at it with something like wonder. They'd built this, together, despite everything working against them. "It's beautiful," Vivian said beside him, one hand on her back where the baby's weight caused constant ache. "It's functional." "Same thing out here." She was right. The horses moved back into the barn that evening. Dahlia and Hope settled into their old stall like they'd never left. And watching them, Caleb felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. They'd survived. Against all odds, they'd survived. Now they just needed to survive one more thing. Vivian went into labor on April 18th, 3 weeks early. Caleb had been mending fence when he heard her call his name. The tone of her voice sent him running. He found her in the cabin, water pooling around her feet, face tight with pain. It's time, she said. The next 24 hours were hell. Doc Henderson came, bringing a midwife named Mrs. Shaw. They set up in the bedroom, sending Caleb out to boil water and fetch supplies and generally stay out of the way. He paced the main room like a caged animal, listening to Vivian's cries through the door. Every sound of pain made him flinch. Every silence was worse. Hours blurred together. Night fell. Dawn came. And still the baby didn't come. Around mid-morning, Doc Henderson emerged, his face grim. "The baby's stuck," he said quietly. "Still breech, and it's not moving. I'm going to have to turn it manually." "Will that work?" "Sometimes. If it doesn't—" Henderson didn't finish the sentence. "Do it," Caleb said. "Whatever it takes. Save her." "I'm going to try to save them both." Henderson went back inside. The screaming started moments later. Caleb stood with his hands pressed against the door, feeling more helpless than he'd ever felt in his life. This was beyond him, beyond guns or strength or stubborn refusal to give up. All he could do was wait and pray to a higher power he wasn't sure existed anymore. Sometime around noon, a baby cried. The sound cut through everything, fear, exhaustion, despair, like sunlight through clouds. Caleb's hands were shaking as he reached for the door handle. Before he could open it, Mrs. Shaw emerged, a tiny bundle in her arms. "You have a daughter, Mr. Mercer." Caleb stared at the baby, impossibly small, red-faced, squalling with impressive volume, and couldn't form words. "Vivian?" he finally managed. "Exhausted. Lost some blood, but she's stable." Mrs. Shaw smiled. "She's asking for you." Caleb took the baby carefully, terrified he'd break her. She weighed nothing, but in his arms she felt like the entire world. Inside the bedroom, Vivian lay propped against pillows, her face pale and drawn, but smiling. When she saw Caleb with the baby, her eyes filled with tears. "Hey," she said weakly. "Hey yourself." Caleb sat on the edge of the bed. "You scared me." "Scared myself." She looked at the baby. "She's okay?" "She's perfect." Doc Henderson cleared his throat. "I'll give you folks some privacy. Mrs. Shaw will stay to help with the feeding. Call if you need anything." After they left, Caleb and Vivian sat together looking at their daughter. "We need to name her," Vivian said. They'd discussed names but never decided. Now holding this tiny person who'd fought so hard to be born, Caleb knew exactly what she should be called. "Sarah," he said quietly, "after my first wife, if that's all right with you." Vivian's expression softened. "It's perfect. Sarah Mercer." Baby Sarah chose that moment to start crying again, her face scrunching up with indignation at the unfairness of being born. Caleb laughed, actual laughter, breaking through the fear and exhaustion. "She's got opinions already. She's your daughter. Of course she does." They spent the rest of the day in that bedroom learning how to be parents, figuring out feeding and swaddling and all the tiny details that came with keeping a human alive. It was terrifying and exhausting and absolutely perfect. That night, with Vivian sleeping and Sarah tucked into the cradle they'd built weeks ago, Caleb stood at the window looking out at the ranch. The barn stood solid against the night sky. The horses were safe in their stalls. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving. This place had almost destroyed them. Fire, winter, violence, loss. It had thrown everything at them, but they'd survived, more than survived. They'd built something real. Behind him, Sarah made a small sound in her sleep. Caleb turned to look at her, this tiny person who was half him and half Vivian, who represented everything they'd fought for. And he understood something he hadn't before. Strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about breaking and choosing to rebuild anyway. Vivian had taught him that. This fierce, stubborn woman who'd walked into his life and refused to let him hide from it, who'd fought beside him, saved his horses, loved him despite all his broken pieces. She hadn't fixed him, but she'd shown him that broken could still be whole enough. Spring turned to summer. Vivian recovered slowly, her body healing from the difficult birth. Sarah grew from a tiny red-faced creature into a baby with Caleb's dark eyes and Vivian's stubborn chin. The ranch thrived. Word had spread about their survival, about the quality of their horses, about Vivian's skill. People came from across the territory to buy stock or ask advice. Mrs. Chen and Mrs. O'Malley visited regularly, bringing food and friendship. Even Mrs. Patterson showed up one day, though her visit was brief and awkward. She looked at Vivian, strong, confident, nursing a healthy baby, and seemed to realize that all her judgments had been wrong. She didn't apologize, but she stopped talking badly about them in town. It was enough. In June, a letter arrived from Boston. Vivian's Aunt Eleanor finally responding to the letter Vivian had sent months ago announcing her pregnancy. Caleb watched Vivian read it, saw emotions chase across her face, hurt, anger, sadness, something that might have been relief. "She wants to visit," Vivian said finally. "Says she's sorry for how things ended between us, that she wants to meet her great niece." "What do you want to do?" Vivian looked at Sarah, sleeping in her cradle. "I want her to see this. The ranch, our life, our daughter. I want her to see what I built when she said I couldn't build anything." "Then invite her." Eleanor Hale arrived in August, stepping off the stagecoach like she was entering enemy territory. She was a small woman, impeccably dressed, with sharp eyes that took in everything. Vivian met her outside the cabin, holding Sarah. For a long moment, the two women just looked at each other. Then Eleanor's face crumpled. "I'm so sorry," she said. "For everything I said, everything I did. I was wrong." Vivian didn't respond immediately. Then she adjusted Sarah in her arms and said, "Come inside. We have a lot to talk about." They talked for 3 days. Caleb gave them space, working with the horses and trying not to eavesdrop. But he heard enough to understand that wounds were being addressed, if not entirely healed. On Eleanor's last night, she asked to speak with Caleb privately. "You've taken good care of her," Eleanor said without preamble. "My niece. You've given her a life I never thought she could have. She gave herself that life. I just had the good sense not to get in her way." Eleanor smiled slightly. "You love her." "More than anything." "Good." Eleanor's expression turned serious. The world was cruel to Vivian. People judged her for things that didn't matter and ignored everything that did. I was part of that cruelty, to my shame. She's stronger than anyone gave her credit for. She is, and you saw that when others didn't. Eleanor extended her hand. "Thank you for that." Caleb shook it, understanding that this was as close to a blessing as he was going to get. Eleanor left the next morning, but not before promising to visit again. The reconciliation wasn't complete, but it was a start. And out here, starts were all anyone could ask for. Fall came with its golden light and promise of another hard winter. But this time, Caleb wasn't afraid. They had the barn. They had supplies. They had neighbors who'd proven they'd help when times got tough. And they had each other. One evening in late September, sitting on the porch with Sarah on his lap and Vivian beside him, Caleb watched the sun set over land he'd almost lost. "What are you thinking?" Vivian asked. "That we made it." "We did." "I mean, really made it, not just survived. We built something." Vivian leaned her head on his shoulder. "We built a life, a real one." Sarah grabbed Caleb's finger with her tiny hand, holding on with surprising strength, and Caleb understood something fundamental. This, right here, right now, was everything he'd fought for without knowing it. Not perfection, not some impossible standard of what life should be. Just this. A woman who loved him, a daughter who depended on him, land that challenged him, work that mattered. It was messy and hard, and some days he still woke up scared. But it was real. And real, he'd learned, was worth more than perfect ever could be. "I love you," he said to Vivian. "I love you too." Sarah made a small sound, and they both laughed. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The horses settled in the barn. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. And on a small ranch in Wyoming territory, 3 people sat together in the fading light, proof that broken things could still build something beautiful. Not despite their scars, but because of them. Years later, when people asked about Caleb and Vivian Mercer, they didn't talk about the mail-order bride arrangement or the difficulties of that first year. They talked about the ranch that grew into one of the finest horse operations in the territory, about the woman who could gentle any animal and run a business better than most men, about the man who'd learned that strength meant more than just endurance. They talked about Sarah Mercer, who grew up riding before she could walk, who inherited her mother's way with horses and her father's quiet determination. They talked about the barn that had burned and been rebuilt stronger, about the neighbors who'd rallied together, about the community that formed in the harshest conditions. But mostly, they talked about two people who'd come together out of desperation and loneliness, and through fire and fear and the kind of challenges that break most people, had built something that lasted. Not a fairy tale, not a romance novel ending, just a real marriage between two imperfect people who chose each other every single day, who learned that love wasn't about completing each other or fixing each other's broken pieces. It was about standing together while the world tried to tear you apart and refusing to let go. That was the story people told, and every word of it was true.